Nevis.
And I'm Tegan Aline.
And today we're talking about a figure that I'm pretty sure is well beloved by a lot of us at this
Hugely,
point.
yeah.
Yeah, if you like anything mystical and magical, you've probably heard of this chap. I'll call him a chap. I don't know if he's old or young. There's lots of stories around that.
Yeah.
Some stories claim that he's born of a virgin. Others say that he's sired by an incubus, which is where he gets his supernatural powers and abilities. He's a shapeshifter, a prophet, a kingmaker, a wild beast man of the forest, and has a literary career spanning 1,500 years. You know, Merlin. Ta-da! Merlin has put the sword in the stone. He built Stonehenge. He knew the truth behind the Holy Grail, which no one does. And he discovered the elixir of life. And people would say, beware Merlin, for he knows all things by the devil's craft. But in other stories, he's also good and almost Christ-like.
Yes.
So,
it's so
Merlin.
Strange. Merlin. What a character. And I think he's such an archetype almost for like wizards that followed in his footsteps in later stories and other things as well.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. I mean, he was really, well, I'm not going to say he was the first wizard or magician that was ever put to paper, but he certainly became famous before a lot of others.
He's kind of iconic, like not even kind of. Merlin is iconic in a way.
Yeah.
The way that these stories have managed to survive and be passed down, even if they're all kind of over the place in a sense, he remains kind of steadfast at one point or another in the story. Merlin is the magical wizard figure. And it's very interesting because almost like in all of the stuff that we have done on this podcast so far, this is the first time we really explore like a magical male on a deeper level. Like we're often looking at the feminine stuff. A lot of the feminine stuff has been, shifted, oppressed, put away over the years. And I think we even see that in the Arthurian legends as well. But it's interesting but it's interesting to kind of explore like this incredible male magical presence, right? I guess with that in mind, we should probably pick up where we left off in terms of the legends. So obviously there's this group of legends that's kind of been compiled from different authors from different periods of time. I think like as early, we have a lot of stories in the 5th century, we have a lot, or 6th century, we have a lot of stories in the coming back around into the 12th century. And in the 12th century is really when the stories start to get filled out by different authors, poets, things to that
nature.
Bards. So where we left off in the stories, I think we kind of covered his Arthur's birth story, his origin story, and then the sword and the stone, right?
Yeah.
So the next legend that kind of comes after that is very interesting. And it starts off in a weird way. So there's a woman, a mysterious woman who just shows up.
Of course there is.
There's always a mysterious woman who just shows up at Arthur's castle. Because, people can just roll up to a castle in medieval.
Yeah.
No guards.
Anyone can just roll up to a castle, of course.
Yeah. So this woman comes up to the castle and she asks for a place to stay for the night. She needs a place to sleep. She's out traveling, and Arthur is finds her very alluring. So he agrees. Sure. And the legend, like the overview of the legend, just basically says they spend the night together.
Oh la la.
Ooh la la, read that into that what you want. And then when he wakes up the next day, she's gone. She's disappeared. She's gone on her way. And he just remembers it as like this incredibly enticing woman came into his life for a night and left. And I mean, knowing what we know now, it sounds very French.
Sure, but also, hey, not a bad way to spend the night. It's not like he sought somebody out. Someone sought his out for the first time in a long time, or maybe ever since we've been talking about things. It's a woman seeking a guy and then leaving the next morning before he wakes up.
True. That's so true. And that is going to take us into like another part of this legend, which is interesting. But anyways, we're jumping ahead. So that is one part of this legend. And then the next part that comes up is, like Arthur's out in battle. He's doing his battle things. And after he's finished fighting, he is very tired. And now he decides to pull up to a random castle because he can't make it all the way back to Camelot. But he's the king, so like he could show up at a nobleman's castle where he
Sure.
is, and everybody's going to be like,
Yeah.
"You're king, come and stay." So Merlin advises Arthur at this point not to stay in this castle, but Arthur's tired and he's not really listening. So he goes and he stays in the castle. And he has, whoever, they don't say outwardly who owns the castle, but as these people are feeding him, they're taking care of him, he goes to lay down, and then all of a sudden, as he's beginning to rest, he hears this beautiful harp music in the distance, and he's again very enticed by the harp music, and he follows it through the corridors of the castle until he comes upon Guinevere. And in this moment, he sees Guinevere. He's very captivated by her, and he's in love with her, and like he's a smitten kitten.
And he's like, I must have her.
Yes, exactly. And Merlin's like, no, don't do that.
Bueno, bad news.
No bueno. Merlin's pretty much like, okay, she is a bad news bear. If you get involved with her, things are not going to go well. And Arthur, credit to him, he's kind of pulling a thing that kings even in our modern days have done, or like, he's like, no, I love this woman. She's the one for me. I don't care what drama she's going to go. So he basically decides, no, he's gonna take Guinevere's hand, and they get married. And that's kind of like where this part of the legend ends. It's just the introduction of Guinevere kind of into the story, and the fact that Arthur is genuinely in love with her. And I think it also continues to like paint his character as a noble, genuine man. And unfortunately, we have the foreshadowing, thanks to Merlin, that him loving this woman is actually going to be his downfall, which we'll see in the later stories. So
thank you for blaming women for the demise of Camelot.
Yay! Again, yay! So after this, we see another legend, and then this next legend is about, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, Mordred. Is that how you would say his name?
That's Mordred. How I say it.
Mordred, okay, yeah. Who is essentially in different stories, he's different things. In the version that I read, so I will tell you the version that I read, and then you can tell me the different part, like what's different. But in the version that I read, these two legends kind of go together. And basically in the second story, King Arthur and Guinevere have been married and living happily ever after for quite a while. They've been ruling, we want to say at least 14 to 15 years at this point. They've been married and together. And one day, a group of 3 women show up at the castle. There's 3 women and a boy. And when Arthur sees them, he doesn't know who they are. And Merlin explains to him that they are actually his half-sisters. So as we know, his mother was previously married, and so they are the daughters of her previous marriage. And one of them is Morgan Le Fay, and there are 2 other ones as well. And the boy is Mordred, but in this version, he is supposedly the son of Arthur and this mysterious woman that showed up at his door.
I've heard that version. I've also heard the version where he's just Arthur's nephew.
Yeah, so there's 2 accounts of this. And this account is much more sinister because it actually it kind of goes into what we were just talking about like condemning Guinevere to be the reason like Camelot falls apart. Because in this version, it's basically Merlin tells Arthur that Morgan Le Fay, who is his half-sister, essentially concocted this plan to get her sister pregnant by her half brother, to produce Mordred.
Yeah.
So the girl that shows up at his door randomly is actually his half sister, but he didn't know about her being his half sister. They sleep together. She gets pregnant, and then she has this kid, Mordred. So he's absolutely he's basically a product of incest, which is danger zones already, but we know incest was like pretty commonplace a long time ago.
Very much so. Very much
Even
so.
not that long ago, if I'm being, even the Edwardian era was pretty incestuous. But anyway.
Yeah, it's fine. We don't have to go into that. We know that it's a thing. They like to keep the bloodlines pure.
Eeky. Anyways, okay, yeah.
Pure.
Purely crazy.
I say with quotation marks.
But so yeah, that's one version, and like you said, there's another version where it's just his nephew, right? Which I guess would still mean
Yes.
it's a son of one of his half sisters or whatever, like that.
Yeah.
So this is kind of interesting because this becomes an introduction of Morgan Le Fay, who is a very mystical character in the stories. And so what ends up happening is that Merlin is worried about Arthur. Arthur's taken on Guinevere, and now this whole situation is going down. So he ends up taking Arthur to a lake, and in this lake there is Nimue, the lady of the lake, and she emerges from the lake with Excalibur. And Merlin basically says, if you're going to be constantly surrounding yourself with all this danger and all of this stuff, you need some protection to get through it. So she gives him Excalibur, and this is when Excalibur gets introduced. And I think there's also some type of shield or something that goes along with it, so that if he ever gets stabbed or hurt, he can't die. And so together, and apparently Excalibur is forged in Avalon, and basically it has magical powers to protect him. So that's kind of like, those two legends kind of go together in that way. But I thought it was really interesting because I always thought, me not knowing things fully, I always thought the sword and the stone and Excalibur were like the same thing. And now I kind of realized that like maybe they weren't.
Yeah. Arthurian legends, like any legend, is very convoluted. Kind of like the Bible, where you see like several creation myths in the very first chapter.
That's such a great example, because that's really the case with these. There's, like, we've already discussed the fact that there's multiple authors and people put their own twist and their own take on everything. You know what I mean? So
yeah. And let's not forget that this stuff was written down way after it would have happened if it was to happen. So inevitably, it's broken telephone.
What did you say?
You play that as a kid.
Between the 5th century and the 6th century and the 12th century, it's like 700 years or something like that, right?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah,
which is crazy.
Huge amount of time.
Yeah.
So all this to say, it's those two parts of the legend are interesting though, because this is like, we've already had an introduction at this point to Merlin, and now we have more mystical characters coming through. In Morgan Le Fay, who is considered kind of like a witch or a sorceress. She's very interesting in this story because she's very dualistic. And then there's also Nimue, who is the lady of the lake, and Avalon is introduced as well, right? So I think that's where we kind of want to like dig in on this episode, is into these mystical elements. Obviously, that's our favorites. Those things are our favorite topics. Don't know if you guys could tell.
You can't go around it. You can't get around it.
No. No.
Do you think that Merlin was real, or like that there was a Merlin that was real?
It's a
loaded question.
Like, I will tell you I'm going to say an answer, but you're going to fucking hate what I'm going to say.
Okay.
And I don't see.
Maybe I'll agree with you.
What I'm going to say is I don't know, and I don't really care, because it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, like, their stories are big enough that they were alive, whether they were real people or not. That's kind of how I feel general about most things. I have to assume, I feel like, just based on all of the stuff that we've researched so far, that maybe he was, and then maybe he was a compilation. I know that in some of my looking into Merlin, at least in the kind of like the story that Jeffrey, we said Joffrey earlier, but maybe it's Jeffrey. It looks like Joffrey to both of us, but Mel looked it up
Yeah,
and
I think
apparently it's
like
Jeffrey.
it's supposed to be Jeffrey. It's the old spelling, the Goff
Yeah.
spelling, which, yeah,
So
you're supposed to say
Jeffrey,
Jeff, but I like to say Joff.
we talked about him in the last episode. Jeffrey, or Joffrey, we like Joffrey better. We're gonna say Joffrey. Joffrey of
Yeah.
Monmouth. He kind of set the stage for what we know as the modern Arthurian legends. He only wrote a couple of them, but like he kind of almost, if you want to say, he kind of set the tone of the stuff that kind of came in the future, and then a bunch of other authors came in and added a lot of romanticism and this and that. And like obviously we'll
Mm-hmm.
get into that, but he kind of took things from a bunch of different places. And what I understand is in his version, he may have conflated like two people, like a Welsh kind of character that was known as being a wild madman. And then
Mm-hmm.
also he might have conflated him with a prince who actually became the king before Uther Pendragon, which was his brother. Anyways, that's a whole thing. I went deep into that, and
Yeah. Okay.
my
So
brain hurt. So
here's my thought process,
I feel
because
like
like,
you're way more linear in this than me, so you take it away.
well, no, I'm just like, I'm a historian, right? Like, this is what I went to school for. So that's just how my brain works.
Yeah, you are.
Um, so historically, yes, it's possible it was based on a real person. Who the hell knows? Legendary possibilities would be there was an authentic prophet living in what are now the lowlands of Scotland at the end of the 6th century, who is most likely a druid surviving in a pagan enclave in the north. So a Merlin prototype may have been a Celtic druid named Leilokin, and I probably like did not pronounce that
I read
well,
about that.
who
Yeah.
yeah, who gained second sight after he went mad and escaped society to live in the forest. And then a poem from the year about 600 describes a Welsh prophet named Merlin,
Yes. Yes. That's yeah.
right? So in the 9th century before Monmouth, there was a monk named Nennius. Now, Nennius's historical or his writings aren't exactly reliable, but we keep referring to him because he used 5th century sources that are no longer in existence. So even
Okay.
though he embellishes stuff, his source work was stuff that we just don't have access to. So he wrote about Merlin being a fatherless man named Ambrosius
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
his prophecies. And then in the year 540, a monk named Gildas wrote The Ruin of Britain, which includes a mention of Ambrosius Aurelianus. And this person was a leader of the Britons who would have been fighting off invaders just before Arthur ascended the throne, which is what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like stories of a bard driven mad after witnessing the horrors of war who fled civilization to become a man in the woods. This is what I think. I think that this all kind of covers different facets of Merlin's life, possibly. I think
Yeah.
that maybe he was a Romano British or Briton leader and then served as an advisor next to Arthur. And then
Yeah.
maybe he went to live as a recluse and went a little mad in his later life. Like,
Yeah.
I think that kind of tracks the story of a person's life, but then it was all mashed together.
That's kind of what, like, I mean, your brain is really doing it well on this, because that's kind of what I was thinking too, but definitely like could not really put it together. But this is exactly what I was thinking as well. I was really taken by this story of this character like going into the wild and kind of losing his mind after war. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
very interesting for a few reasons. First of all, we know now in this modern era that war is like completely traumatizing. And that might sound like, at this point, many people could listen to this and be like, yeah, obviously we know that. But this is like a concept that we've really only been discussing like pretty recently in our society, just how
Yeah.
damaging war can be on the psyche. But here we have really, really early stories of war actually driving a man insane. But then
Mhm.
there's that other element of him emerging and um, developing sight. Because, like, I don't know if you've caught this at all in your research into the occult, but a lot of people in the world of clairvoyance and in the world of like psychics and things like that usually claim to have had something really damaging or really traumatic happen to them, and that is
Mhm.
ultimately what starts to connect them to having visions and seeing things.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, oh yes, it's something we hear, and it's, I shouldn't even say claim, because sometimes actually they did have very traumatizing things happen to them. And there is something about having something physically traumatizing happen to you in this, like, in the physical world, that starts to
Mhm.
bring on the sight of like an altered space or a liminal space. So I think that it's
Mhm.
really cool to see a reference like that so early on, because this is actually something like we see a lot. Even now, there's even authors that have come out with, like, their versions of spirituality in like our modern time, that kind of follow in that same vein of going through something incredibly traumatizing that leads to them becoming kind of like a prophet or priestess or something like that. So
Yeah.
I think that's kind of cool and
Yeah.
interesting that's there.
I agree with you. I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
And yeah, I know like we're talking about the myth and legend of Merlin, but I kind of had to just go into that because
Hmm.
it's a possible historical thread, and it's a way to possibly explain all of these different facets and why they don't necessarily mash together in the way that they're presented to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I find his character really interesting because, like you said, there's pieces of him that, yeah, it was a bit of a digression and a bit of a tangent I just went on there, but actually it's an important one to the character of who ultimately like
Mhm.
Merlin becomes, because he becomes so powerful if he's mixed also with this other character of
Mhm.
Ambrosius or whatever. Those
Yeah,
things kind of going
Ambrosius
hand in hand.
Aurelianus, and Ambrosius Aurelianus was a real person. Like that is historical
Mhm.
fact. So,
Yeah, and we kind of, and I think we were talking about this before the podcast, that like I was saying to Mel that this Geoffrey of Monmouth guy, he's kind of like one of our earliest versions of a historical fiction writer. Like we have many of those
mhm.
today, and because we have a system for the way that we intake literature and historical fact, we can differentiate. But back then they didn't really have that. So yeah,
No,
yeah, he was
absolutely
passing it
not.
off as truth, but it was some of it was based in folklore, some of it was based in fact, some of it was like his whole thing. Apparently in his book there's like a whole chapter dedicated to a prophecy of Merlin. Did you read about that at all?
In whose book? Sorry. Oh, in Monmouth's?
Yeah, so apparently part of his
Yeah.
book, so his book is like about the kings of Britain, right? So he
Yes.
goes
Yeah.
through a huge history, and he also kind of like ties in a lot of those missing links, like where did Merlin come from and all of this kind of stuff, like through that history. It's quite like extensive. But
Yeah.
at one but at one point he, after Merlin kind of, I think I told you this and I can't remember if I said it on the podcast or not, that story about the white dragon and the red dragon fighting
You
each other.
haven't. We should definitely go into that at some point.
Okay. Okay. I could go into it now if you want, unless we want to go somewhere else, cuz it's a story. Like it's
No, but it
it's a
is
bit
a
long.
cool story.
It is a cool story. So for me, my question, I've just decided I'm going to launch into it. For me, my question has always been, where does Merlin first show up in these Arthurian legends, right? But the
Mhm.
the book that Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote, it wasn't the Arthurian legends necessarily. It was like the
Mm-mm.
beginning of that, but actually it was like a history of all of the kings that passed through the British Isles. And let me tell you, there was a lot of them. And so, fuck
There
my
was a
life.
lot of them. It was very it was a lot of fact. Like, so like a lot of the stuff that we pull from the Arthurian legends, all the details and fantastical elements, they come later. Monmouth's version is really just like presenting
There's a
mostly
lot of
fact. Like,
historical
it's
reference in it. Yeah.
bare bones.
And he
Yeah.
starts it like at the end of like the Romans losing the Trojan War. So at one point, let's just put it this way. I'm going to skip a huge chunk of it because it will, like, it's a podcast in itself. But at one point, the British Isles are not doing too well, and the Archbishop of London goes to Brittany in France. And this is kind of why I chose to start it at this area, because I always never fully understood how Brittany, which is part of France, was involved in all of this, and how the French fucking got involved in all of this in the first place. So apparently, yeah, the Romans had pieced out. There was a lot of kings and stuff that passed in that meantime. But right now, they're not in a good position, and they're getting invaded a lot by Saxons and Picts, which are like the people from Scotland at the time, and so on and so forth. So anyways, the Archbishop of London goes to Brittany and basically goes to the King of Brittany, and he's like, can you like take us under your banner? And he says, I'm not going to do it, but my brother Constantine will do it. So Constantine goes to the British Isles, and he starts to defend off all of the people or whatever, all of the Saxons or whatever. And then he gets married, and he has 3 sons. And the 3 sons are Constans, who becomes a monk. And then there's Ambrosius. What did you say his full name was? Something Ambrosius. It's
Ambrosius Aurelianus.
Okay, Ambrosius Aurelianus. And then there's Uther Pendragon, and those are supposed to be his 3 sons. And so this guy, this king, he dies. Can't remember how right now, sorry. But he dies, and then it's like, who's going to take over the throne? Technically, his oldest son should take it over, but he's a monk. So it's not really like his spot. So then, but the other 2 are actually young boys at this point, right? So there is a nobleman at this point, and his name is Vortigern. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know who you're talking about. I had a hard time saying his name too.
I just want to say Voldemort at this point in time. So Voldemort, no. So Vortigern, he sees an opening to become the king himself. And so what he does is he goes to the monastery where the firstborn son is, and he convinces him to leave the monastery and take his place as king. So he does that. And then when he does that, basically what happens is Vortigern starts puppeting him and controlling him. So yeah,
story as old as time.
So eventually his plan is to have picked assassins. Oh yeah, that's how their father Constantine dies. He gets assassinated by a picked assassin. And anyways, then his son, who has now taken over, also gets killed by a pick. And this nobleman, Vortigern, is like, okay, well, we are gonna like pursue the Picts. We're gonna like kill the assassins. But he was the one that actually got the assassins to do this in the first place, right? He had to kill the assassins as a show. So he kills the Pict assassins, and of course, it causes a retaliation.
What did I think was going to happen?
Oh my gosh. It's just so, I can't even believe I can freaking remember this. Like, holy crap. It's crazy.
Well, it's a soap opera, you know?
Yeah. So anyways, now he is fighting with the Picts that are coming from like the part, like from Scotland, essentially the area we know as Scotland today. And he doesn't really have a lot, like basically the people in Britain are kind of getting stressed out because this is constantly happening. Somehow these Saxon guys roll up on shore with an army for hire. And then this Vortigern guy is like, yeah, sure. I'm going to hire you guys to fight off the Picts. So they do. And in the process, he meets one of their daughters, falls in love with her, and gets married. And so he does. He he emerges with the Saxons. The Britons are not having it. They don't like it because, like, up until this point, they're like considered invaders. So this Vortigern guy is like giving these two Saxon warlords and like their people, he's like giving them land. He's like giving them a lot of stuff. They're basically family now. And the Britons really don't like it. In and amongst all of this, Ambrosius and Uther Pendragon have been sent back to Brittany because they're young boys and they're like being sent away to be kept safe so they don't get killed, by this guy.
Yeah.
And people are getting more and more pissed about this whole situation. There's a bunch of other stuff that happens. Basically, what ends up happening is that I think somebody new gets crowned. I want to say maybe it's actually his son, Vortigern's son, which is like Vortimern or something like that. And Vortigern is forced to flee. He's forced to flee to Wales. So this is I'm sorry. I tried to figure out a way to shorten it to get to the part where we meet Merlin, but it's very hard to explain it all.
No, you kind of need the backdrop for it. Like
you kind of do, especially when you figure out who the dragons are. You kind of do. So anyways, this guy, Vortigern, he hightails it to Wales. And he has these soothsayers. So imagine he's on the run. He's in an encampment and he still has these advisors, these soothsayers giving him advice. And he's like, what do I do now? Because pretty much Britain is pissed at him because Britain, basically, he's let Saxons come in and kind of like,
yeah, they've been fighting against the Saxons for so long.
And there's a little bit of a like,
there's bad blood.
Yeah, there's bad blood. Exactly. So anyways, this new king, who I believe is honestly his son, wants he agrees with the people of Britain. So he wants to get the Saxons out, and he also kind of wants to punish his dad. It's the whole thing. So anyways, this guy, Vortigern, he takes off to Wales. The soothsayers tell him to build a defense, not a castle, but
some sort of wall defense or something.
A medieval kind of thing. I can't remember what the name of it is right now, but like a thing with bricks that will protect him. Let's call it castle.
Dear.
Well, let's call it a castle.
Just call it a walled defense, which is a fortress.
That's it. So they tell him to build a fortress. God damn it. I feel like my ADHD.
You're almost there. You're
almost there. I know I am. So he goes to build this fortress, and as the people are building the fortress, every day it's crumbling down. And he's like, I can't build this fortress because every day it's falling apart. So he goes back to the soothsayers and he says, what should I do? And the soothsayers tell him he has to spread the blood of a boy born without a father on the land, and that will stop the building from falling apart. So he sends people out searching far and wide for a boy that's born without a father. And because of what you said earlier, apparently Merlin is born to a nun that and he was conceived by her relationship with incubus. Yeah.
Incubus.
Incubus is meant to be half human, half angel. That's where Merlin gets all of his powers from. And because technically he has no father, because an incubus is not a human, I guess, he's the god. So Merlin is brought back to this Vortigern guy who is running for his life right now. And he says, I'm trying to build this castle and it keeps falling apart. And apparently I have to spill your blood to make it to stop. So Merlin is smart.
He's just explaining this to the child. I have to kill you now.
Yeah. But the kid, he's like maybe not a child exactly, but like around teenager age, I want to say in this story.
Yeah.
And he's like,
has some self-preservation.
Yeah. And he's like, yeah, but your soothsayers are actually lying. You don't need to kill me. You just need to know what's going on underneath. And he says, if you dig a hole, you're going to see that there's a great lake underneath where you're trying to build the castle. And there are 2 dragons, and every night they fight. And that's why your building keeps falling down. And so he decides to listen to Merlin, wants to see if he's right. So he digs this tunnel underground and finds this lake and sees a white dragon and a red dragon fighting each, or like laying there. But every night they get up and they fight. So when they dig the hole, the dragons come out. And there's actually you can actually look this up. There's some pretty cool medieval drawings of like the white dragon and the red dragon kind of fighting each other. So every night the white dragon and the red dragon fight. And every night the white dragon kind of like beats back the red dragon, but then the red dragon always comes back. And so Merlin, this is kind of where his prophecy starts off in this. And he prophesizes to this guy that the white dragon represents the Saxons that this guy let into the land and let start to take over things. And the red dragon represents Britain, which if we look at stuff we know now, the red dragon is on the flag of Wales. And so the red dragon is being pushed back into the land and back into the thing and back into the country, onto the edges of the country. And Merlin in this moment prophesizes that this is going to be the future of the island, that the Saxons are going to actually take over, and that the original Brittonic people will be pushed back. And that's actually interesting to me because I realized there that the Britons at this point are actually what we consider the Welsh people now.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah, they absolutely are.
Which I didn't really realize that or put that together before this.
Yeah, and they fought long and hard. They fought long and hard.
Well, because when I think of like
formidable
Britain,
fighters for a really long time.
When I think about Britons, I think about like our current spelling, like the British, you know what I mean?
Yes.
But actually in this, when we're talking about Britons, it's spelled Briton, and it's kind of like the different tribes that were associated like before everything that we know now. But I didn't realize that they were actually like what we would consider the Welsh now. So anyways, that's all very, very interesting. But this is the first introduction of Merlin into the story, and he leads out this huge prophecy. And so Vortigern is like, what do I do? Because obviously now he's seeing the Saxons are actually going to beat out. And Merlin basically says, you should just run and hide because they're going to come for you. And one day the boar, and then he says, one day the boar of Cornwall will emerge and he will set everything right. And the boar of Cornwall is supposed to be Arthur.
Right. Yeah, so Merlin's seeking out Arthur for a really long time and like made it his life's mission to grow Arthur. Him into he prophesizes Arthur, but then kind of like makes it his life mission to seek him out and like turn him into a good and noble king and make sure that he isn't corrupted by the systems in place and by the people around him. And like he has really good intentions. Okay. Merlin has really good intentions.
Yeah. And it's interesting because in the basic legends, you're kind of like questioning, like, why did he take him away from his parents? Why did he do all this? So anyways, all this to say, after all this happens, the two original sons of Constantine, they're grown up now. They come back, and immediately Ambrosius is considered the king. Like the Britons want all of this stuff sorted out. They don't really necessarily want Vortigern's son taking over things. You know what I mean? So he's considered the rightful heir at this point. And so he is really accredited with like when they really start to like push off the Saxons, they go after Vortigern and they actually burn him in one of his fortresses. Didn't work too well. He dies. And then at some point he gets sick and he almost dies. And Vortigern's family, like people from his family, convince somebody to poison Ambrosius, so he actually dies. And that's how Uther Pendragon becomes the king.
You wonder how we get soap
swear
operas?
To God.
Like, just listen.
I swear I'm going really somewhere with this. I can't tell you how stressed out I am. Oh, fuck. The fact that that's just like a couple paragraphs in that story is just fucking
it's pretty mind-boggling. It's a wild story.
In the time that Ambrosius becomes the king, that is the time when Merlin starts advising Ambrosius, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting because it's like we said, I swear I'm bringing it back around, I'm bringing it home. We said earlier that the two of them were kind of like conflated with each other, but
Yes.
in this is Joffrey's like, is it real, is it fake story? This is like where they meet and they kind of come together, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
also very, very interesting. Are they the same person? Are they two aspects of the same person at this point?
It's hard to
Yeah.
know. It's hard to know. Like, again, by the time Jeffrey was writing, or Joffrey was writing, whatever, it was so
Jeff Joff.
long after. Like,
Yeah,
there's no
yeah,
way
it really
to
was.
know.
And we talked about that a lot in like the last episode, and the way that he says he was translating a text into Latin, but there's literally no traces of the text. And I'm sure that actually
No.
happens a lot with a lot of the old stuff. But
Yeah.
anyways, very interesting. Like this is where Merlin kind of comes into play initially. And I feel like a lot of these, so he's maybe piecemealed from different ideas or different archetypes, and but he becomes
Mm-hmm.
quite it's really interesting because if all of the things about him are true, he actually channels all of the hardship that he faced and he turns it into something that positively affects the future. And I think
Yeah.
maybe that's why he's the type of character that people really hold on to. And, you know, you see traces of him even like in a character like Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or many other wise, wizardly figures.
Mm-hmm.
Merlin is kind of like there's an essence of him in all of them. And I think that that's where that whole thing kind of comes from. You know what I mean?
I think so. I
Mm-hmm.
agree with you there. I totally agree with you there. Wow, this is just Merlin. We haven't even touched upon the other stuff.
You know, I'm sorry. At the beginning, I was like, okay, let's do all of the other stuff together. Like, let's do it all together as like a mystical package. But then, like, when I was reading the Merlin stuff, I was like, oh.
Merlin goes, it's a lot. So what we can say about some of the other stuff, what's really interesting about the Merlin figure, or like the figure of Merlin in most of the stories, is that he often has a really close relationship with a feminine character,
Hmm.
often the Lady of the Lake, who is described as being like this positive force in the Arthurian world.
Mm-hmm.
So remember, like you touched on it, the Lady of the Lake gave Arthur the magical sword Excalibur.
Mm-hmm.
But also there's some stories in which she kidnaps Sir Lancelot as a child, and then he becomes Lancelot du Lac
Mm-hmm.
as an
Yes.
adult, right? Lancelot
I've
of the
heard that
Lake.
I've heard some where she kidnaps him, but other ones where he's like basically left without his parents, so she's
Yeah.
actually just adopted him.
Yeah. So who knows? Lady of the Lake goes by many names. So Nemwe is one of them. Probably more famous now also because of the show Cursed that was on Netflix a couple
Mm-hmm.
of years ago, but
Yes.
also goes by Vivian, Elaine, and Nynaeve.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, there are a couple of theories of like, oh, well, there might be more than one Lady of the Lake, or maybe it's just multiple facets of her personality. This is all very complicated, okay? Lady of the Lake's also been associated with a Celtic goddess and like stories of water fairies,
Mm-hmm.
and she's super ambiguous. And in the most
Mm-hmm.
early appearances of her legends and stories, um, she loves Merlin, but like also still. Okay, so in like the nice versions
Your
of the
turn.
stories, in the nice versions of the stories, in the Vulgate d'Histoire de Merlin, she loves the enchanter, seals him in a magically constructed, beautiful tower so she can keep him for herself, and she visits him regularly and ends up falling in love with him. And then
Mm.
in a continuation of Vulgate Merlin, known as Suite du Merlin, the relationship's really different. And when Merlin shows her, okay, so there's a couple of things. When Merlin shows her a tomb of two lovers magically sealed, she enchants him and then has him cast into the tomb on top of the two lovers, and then she reseals the tomb and he dies a really slow death. In another story, He's then kept in a tree or in a cave underground, and he's still there today.
Mm-hmm. I've also heard stories where he was in love with her and she wasn't interested, but she wanted to learn his
Yeah.
magic. And then,
Yes.
so she
And then she
locks him in
takes
the cave.
advantage and exploits that.
We couldn't help,
Yeah.
Mel and I could not help but notice that most of the characters in most of the female characters in Camelot, no matter who fucking wrote it, they're pretty one-sided. They're definitely like not complex, diverse, multifaceted characters in the
No.
original legends. No matter who wrote it, they're like either an object of desire or they're an object of magic, but magic that turns sour. It's really interesting
Mm-hmm.
because Merlin is kind of perpetuated as the like benevolent figure, and then
Yeah.
the women in the stories, sometimes they're benevolent, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're quite the opposite. Sometimes they're like sorceresses or like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
locking people in caves and things like that. So we couldn't help but notice that. I
They're
feel
much
like.
more devious in nature, and they're blamed for a lot of the things that go wrong in the fall of Camelot. Very
Absolutely.
heavily. Very, very heavily.
Mhm.
But yeah, I do remember that. Like, she doesn't return his affection, but persuades him to teach her his magic, and then she uses his magic against him. So, like, Merlin is pretty indestructible, except when it comes to the Lady of the Lake. She's kind of his kryptonite, sadly.
Yeah, and that also seems to be a theme amongst, because I was saying to Mel before we started recording that there seems to be a theme amongst the kings. They all seem impervious except when it comes to the charms of a woman.
Well, yeah, Uther
That
was in
seems
love
to
with
be
Igraine, and it was like, I must have her. And then Arthur said that about
right,
Guinevere. These women didn't
right.
necessarily love them back right away.
Even
It wasn't
Igraine,
necessarily a
when she
two-sided
sleeps with
relationship.
Uther, even
Yeah.
Igraine, when she sleeps with Uther, she thinks that it's her husband. And by
Yeah.
everything that I've picked up so far, they don't talk about her husband very much. But from what I gather, she actually liked her husband.
She
So the
liked her
fact that
husband, and
Uther
then
just,
Merlin helped Uther trick her and use magic to make Uther look like her husband to sleep with her, and that's how Arthur was born.
and then yeah, and then they're pissed off when the half sisters of this other marriage show up on the doorstep and they're wondering why Morgan Le Fay is bitter. You know what I mean? Is she
Yeah.
even bitter? That she's another very interesting character, which we didn't really get to even dive into her and Avalon and everything. But
No.
I always thought it was
No.
interesting, Morgan Le Fay. I couldn't put my finger on the le because I always thought of this as an exclusively like English story. But now that I realize there's so many like French like influences in
Lots
this,
of
now
French
I
influence,
understand,
yeah.
because I think it's the French writers that really start to build out Morgan Le Fay, which is basically meant to say Morgan of the Fairies, right? Like
Yeah.
character, right?
Well, and
Mm-hmm.
that's something that's kind of interesting because Morgan Le Fay, I mean, we touched on her before and she's a witch and everything like that, but bring it back to the Lady of the Lake. Lady
Mm.
of the Lake is associated with Celtic water spirits and goddesses like Ceridwen. Ceridwen, yeah, that's how you say it, I think.
Oh yeah, that's
Who's
actually
like,
Welsh, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Who's
And
this Celtic
Rhiannon too, I
goddess who
understand.
possesses, sorry?
And Rhiannon as well, who's also a Welsh
Yes.
and Cerridwen are both. I mean, Rhiannon and Cerridwen are both Welsh goddesses specifically that kind of get like adapted into the overall Celtic pantheon. But yeah, she has connection to both of them. Yeah.
She does. Yeah.
Mhm.
And also to Breed, who is a goddess who kept watch over wells, and like Ceridwen would basically brew herbs and water that would grant wisdom to whoever would drink it and things like that. So like the Lady of the Lake is this wise figure, but is also associated to yet another goddess who in this story is then like diminished into being this horrible figure.
Yeah. And I think I also read at one point, maybe the Lady of the Lake, well, like you said earlier, the Lady of the Lake could actually be 3 different ladies of the lake, but also at one point, maybe Morgan Le Fay and the Lady of the Lake were one character, which
Yeah.
would kind of explain, because for the most part, I know the Lady of the Lake to be like quite a good character, and I know Morgan Le Fay to be like a dark character. But what
Mm-hmm.
have we noticed about stories about women historically and everything before? They love to divide it.
Yeah.
They love to picture women as either completely dark and obsessive or completely light and like giving, and they very much
We're
like to
not
separate.
complicated beings.
Yeah, no. And
Didn't you
so
know?
the fact the idea that they could have been one character makes a hell of a lot of sense to me
Yeah.
when that is something that we've seen so much in time
Mm-hmm.
leading up to this point, when we were discussing Diana and like Artemis and all of that kind
Mm-hmm.
of stuff, you know what I mean? So whew, it's really deep. And so we know that we can see that it's possible that maybe Morgan Le Fay and the Lady of the Lake were one person at one point. But again, like these are kind of the things that we're up against when we're discovering or like going through all these myths and legends, is that there are so many different variations and things for everybody across the
Mm-hmm.
board. And you know, I kind of had this thought before we met up today about the fact that there are actual historians that have like dedicated their entire study to these legends.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're a little lost and confused too. They've got theories, but everyone has a different theory,
Yeah, there's no way to like
right?
concretely prove anything, but it's all
It's
very
all
interesting.
educated guesses. Like a lot of history is educated guesses.
Yeah, and I think
That's all we can do.
we've said that like quite a few times actually in this podcast already.
Yeah, because the more we talk about it, the more we realize we don't know shit.
Yes, and that's kind of what I've always thought. People always said when it comes to becoming wise, the older you get, the more you should know that you know nothing. And I've always thought that
Yeah.
it kind of made sense in a lot of way. And sitting going through all this stuff that we go through
It's
in these topics,
solidifying that
it's
thought.
very much solidifying. Solidifying that thought.
So we didn't go too much into, we really just like touched upon the Lady of the Lake. There's so much more to say about the Lady of
Mm,
the Lake and Avalon and the stories and legends around that. But I think we wanted to quickly bring her up because, you know, we mentioned Merlin as like coming from this really good place and having his own unique story, but also helping Uther to like get some chick pregnant that wasn't his wife and like all sorts of stuff. So he's not flawless, but
no.
his demise, his downfall, basically, especially in later stories, is the Lady of the Lake, who is often described as this positive force in the Arthurian world, but really fucks Merlin over a little
Ultimately.
bit,
Yeah.
ultimately, especially in later legends. So, like, you can't talk about Merlin without at least talking about the Lady of the
A
Lake a
little
little bit.
bit. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But I think this is like a really, I don't know, this was a legitimate rabbit hole into Merlin for me, and but it was very interesting. What was that thing you were saying before the podcast about Merlin living in a black hole?
Oh, okay. Okay. This is because uh, Tegan's friend Peter,
Hi, Peter.
you met up with him, right?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I met up with my friend Peter, and he basically said that there's a theory, which we're not going to get into the theory. We might actually bring him on the show to like get into that theory at some point. But he has there's a apparently he told me of a theory that's out there where Merlin is living like history in reverse. So he's not going backwards through time or anything, and he's not Benjamin Buttoning or anything, but like he is living through history in reverse. So like I think Peter was saying like the first time he picks up Arthur as a baby is actually him putting him down, for example. And then you said that it's like
And
he's
then
living in
I
a black
said,
hole.
yeah, I was like, it sounds like he's like going through a black hole because there's also a theory that says that, you know, if we were to go through a black hole, we would basically see all of history in reverse and could kind of see the creation of the Big Bang before we all get spaghettified and die.
Wow. No time.
Right? So I was just like, is that the liminal state that he's living in, basically? I don't know.
But I feel like it
Bit of a
feels
mind fuck if that's so.
it's absolutely a mind fuck. But I feel
We
like
should have Peter on to explain this better.
I think so for sure. But I mean, at the same time, it does kind of encapsulate like the way we feel about the Arthurian legends in general at this point, I want to say, or at least the way I feel about the Arthurian legends, I want to say. Because every time I think I'm going to like understand, like just go through the story, it's like, it's a layer within a layer within a layer. And I had no
Oh,
idea.
Tegan.
I had no
You
idea they
should
went this.
know by now. It's never straightforward.
I know, but I didn't expect this to go that deep, man. Like, holy guacamole. Oh my goodness. So, anyways, we hope you enjoyed this exploration into the really rabbit hole character of Merlin.
Also, BBC's Merlin is actually a good show, and I'm annoyed
Yes.
that it's not on Canadian Netflix anymore. I should turn it on my VPN and put it in the UK and see if it's still on there, because
Yes.
it's honestly good, and it shows Merlin. And obviously, this is like totally taking things out of context and is based on the Arthurian legends, but it's showing Merlin as a young man for once, and Arthur as a young king, and like him trying to help. But he is this, like, when we think of magic and we think of people that are magical, like thinking of something and having it appear in their hand and being able to move things with their minds, like that's the sort of magic that's in the show. So it's like not accurate at all, but it is a good show.
But I mean, like,
and there's the dragon, and there's a big dragon.
Who cares about accuracy? Like,
yeah, I know, it's just good. Watch it.
It's only good. All of this is only maybe like 20% factual. If I don't know,
that's a really high percentage.
I'm pulling a number completely out of my ass. But
I feel like 2%.
It's like all stories with sprinkles of facts, with factual sprinkles on top. Maybe, I don't know, but you know, this to say you can kind of drive what you want out of it. But I think it's cool. I actually really like more and more that in like this modern time that we're developing the magical characters more. And I would bet that at a certain point in the past they were already more developed, but that's probably been lost over time, and because of religious wars, and we'll see as we're talking about very mystical elements. It's interesting because like as we go into the story later, this takes a vastly Christian turn.
So well, and that is a byproduct of the time that people were writing in, right?
Exactly. So we'll explore that as well. But you know, like all this to say, it's cool that we're exploring these characters more fully now in a time where, you know, relatively people can, in most places, people can just believe what they want to believe, which is cool.
Yeah. So we'll leave it there for today. Remember to like and subscribe. Send us an email, allegorystorypodcast@gmail.com, or follow Instagram, Allegory Story Podcast, at Allegory Story Podcast. And we'll see you next time.